The shocking truth, the one word. John repeated 98 times, and why he never used again. What if the most important thing in John's Gospel is not a doctrine you hold, but an action you do? What if the book that gives us the Word made flesh presses not for a static possession called faith, but for a repeated, present-tense movement, a verb that appears nearly 100 times? John's Gospel is, by one careful count, saturated with the verb pisteuō, to believe, used roughly 98 times. Remarkably, the Greek noun pistis, the noun we usually translate faith, does not appear in the Gospel at all. That absence is not an accidental quirk. It is the hinge on which John's whole literary and theological architecture turns. The claim sounds small, almost pedantic, but it is not. Language choices shape theology. When John insists on a verb over a noun, he is teaching us who Jesus is in the mode he wants us to meet, not as an article of doctrine to be possessed, but as a living presence to be entered into. This is the shocking truth John layers into every scene, every sign, every long conversation that makes his gospel different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Most of John's material, by some counts up to 90%, is unique to him. He's not retelling the synoptic narratives for their own sake. He's reconfiguring the story so that the reader must move. Before we follow that movement, a quick word. If you like deep scripture reads that balance careful attention to the text with practical application, subscribe and stick with me through this study. I promise to keep the Greek to a minimum and the implications clear. Now, a very brief context. Tradition names the beloved disciple as the eyewitness and the voice behind the gospel. Most scholars date this gospel in the latter part of the 1st century, roughly AD 85 to 95, after the synoptic gospels had circulated. John writes not to repeat facts, but to interpret them. He tells fewer of the shared stories and spends much more time on extended encounters. Intimate meals, protracted dialogues, theological monologues. The opening lines of the Gospel make his agenda explicit. In the beginning was the Word, and then the claim, the Word became flesh. Logos, the Greek philosophical term, meets davar, the Hebrew notion of God's spoken, creative word. John wants his reader to see Jesus as the one who is not merely powerful or wise, but who is the very agent of making. Language fused to reality. That fusion, logos enfleshed, gives us a key to John's style. He is obsessed with identity. Who is this? Is the question that organizes everything. The signs he records, the long I am statements, the farewell discourse, the cross and resurrection. All of it is arranged so the reader ends up before an identity claim. John's Gospel is less a chronicle of deeds and more an unfolding of who Jesus is and what our response must be. One of the first textual clues to John's method is vocabulary, where the synoptics often highlight dunamis, power, mighty works that evoke awe and immediate response. John repeatedly uses semeion, sign. The difference matters. Dunamis speaks to force and demonstration. Semeion is intentionally a pointer. A sign points beyond itself to meaning. It is interpretive, relational, invitational. John's signs are staged to elicit a decision. They are designed to push the reader or onlooker toward a choice, to move into a relationship with the one pointed to. John organizes these semia into 7 key scenes that function as escalating demonstrations of Jesus' identity and authority. They are not merely miracles to make a crowd cheer. They are steps in an argument. List them quickly. The wedding at Cana, water into wine. The healing of the royal official's son, distance healed. The healing at the pool of Bethesda, long-term suffering relieved. The feeding of the 5,000, multiplication and provision, walking on water, command over nature and rescue, the healing of the man born blind, reversal of a congenital existential condition, and finally, the raising of Lazarus from death, the decisive reversal of the final enemy. Each sign raises the stakes. Look at how the sequence builds. Cana begins with transformation inside a home, a change in substance that hints at new creation. The royal official's son introduces faith that must bridge physical distance and social distance. An outsider begs a near impossible healing from the inside. Bethesda moves the conversation into the long term, into chronic suffering that resists quick fixes. The feeding of the 5,000 shows abundance that points to messianic provision. Walking on water and the rescue that follows moves the scene into cosmic control. Jesus as one who treads the powers of chaos. The man born blind is not just a healed eye. It's a theological reversal. What has been dark is becoming light. Finally, Lazarus is death undone, a sign so extreme that it becomes the hinge to the cross. After each sign, John does something that to a modern reader might seem repetitive, but is actually strategic. He follows the spectacle with words. The sign does its work of attracting attention. The discourse does the work of interpretation. The narrative wants you to look, and then it wants you to listen. This is where John's obsession with verb over noun becomes vivid. The scene invites a response. Believe. See the water turn to wine, and then hear the bridegroom's joy become a suggestive image of a new messianic banquet. Witness the healing from a distance, and you must choose. Will you cross the threshold of trust? Observe the restoration of sight, and you are compelled to ask, can I see in this way? John's rhetorical architecture is identity first. Who is this? Then evidence. Look at the signs. And finally, invitation. Do the act of believing. It's hardly neutral. Consider the first sign in particular, because John stages it with a kind of domestic intimacy that sets a pattern. The wedding in Cana. Wine runs low, a potential embarrassment in a village community. Jesus, at his mother's prompting, turns water into wine. The event reads small, almost silly, until you realize what John is doing. New creation language undergirds the moment. The water jars used for Jewish purification rituals are filled, then emptied into stone, transformed. The miracle isn't primarily a party trick. It's a sign about the coming abundance of God's reign, a kind of inaugurated transformation that begins quietly and invites recognition. Those who tasted the wine call it good, but John is asking you to taste and decide. When the ordinary turns extraordinary, what will you do? A little later, the royal official's son offers a complementary theme, the necessity of belief across distance. A father comes to Jesus on behalf of a child who is far away, and Jesus' word heals the boy before Jesus arrives. This sign compresses a theological point into a human scene. Belief is not dependent on sight. The Father's trust in Jesus' word, the gospel is performed at a distance, becomes a parable for readers. You can believe in the efficacy of Jesus' word without being present at the same table. John repeats and reinforces this dynamic. Jesus speaks, and reality follows. Hearing his word should make you act. At the pool of Bethesda, the case changes. Here the scene is tangled in ritual and law, a place of long-standing suffering. The man who has lain there for 38 years is healed, and the healing prompts not joy alone, but controversy. The Jewish leadership questions Jesus about Sabbath practices and authority. The question shifts from can Jesus heal to by what authority does he heal? John stages debate because he's less interested in demonstrable power than credible identity. The signs force confrontation. Those who seek to preserve religious order are unsettled by an authority that does not fit their categories. The feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water together expand the scope, provision and power over chaos. John frames these as pointers to something deeper. Bread points to sustenance, and when Jesus later says, "I am the bread of life," the earlier scene becomes a rehearsal. Walking on water amplifies the sense that this man who eats, speaks, and heals is not merely a charismatic teacher. he moves freely in the domain of creation. Each sign pushes the narrative from the particular to the cosmic, and with each push, Jesus' identity presses in on the reader. Then John stages two signs that demand existential choice. The healing of the man born blind is not a tidy cure, but a moral existential event. The healed man moves from being defined by his condition to being defined by his encounter with Jesus. Yet the crowd and the leaders are more interested in placing him than in asking him what he saw. The scene exposes blindness, not as a physical lack alone, but as a spiritual posture. Light and sight become metaphors for receiving Jesus. The reader is asked, "Am I a spectator, or will I follow the one who gives sight?" And then Lazarus. The raising of Lazarus is, structurally and theologically, the climax of the sign series. It reverses death, the ultimate boundary. John puts this scene so close to the cross that it becomes simultaneously a triumph and a provocation. The raising of Lazarus prompts those invested in maintaining order to move from questioning to plotting. It forces the question of identity into deadly political terms. Who is this that raises the dead? If Jesus can reverse death, then the stakes are ultimate. The powers of the day will react accordingly. John uses the sign to make the world choose. After each of these scenes, conversations happen. Private dialogues with disciples, public debates with Pharisees, tender exchanges with individuals like Nicodemus or the Samaritan woman that read like sacramental moments. John's technique is consistent. A public sign, then intimate theological speech. It's as though John is saying, "You saw it, now hear what it means." And the meaning continually returns to one imperative verb: believe. This brings us to the move from sign to statement, and especially to the 7 "I am" claims that tessellate the gospel. The "I am," ego eimi statements are not metaphors in the bland sense. They are identity claims that bind Jesus to cosmic realities and human needs. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And later, I am the vine. Each one ties an existential human need to a divine provision. These declarations are not optional poetic flourishes. They are theological anchors. John's careful placement of them after signs makes the connection explicit. The signs show the "I am" statement's name. Now notice the grammar of these claims. In Greek, ego eimi is the simple present "I am." Most often in John, Jesus does not append a predicate with an article-less construction. He simply says, "I am." At John 8:58, he famously says, "Before Abraham was, I am." That line triggered a visceral reaction from those hearing it. Why? Because an "I am" without a predicate in Jewish scriptural memory connects to the divine name revealed to Moses, the self-existent creator. John's evangelist is playing with echo and implication. These "I am" sentences do more than comfort. They compress identity. When Jesus claims, "I am the light," he does so with the weight of divine self-revelation behind the phrasing. The hearing mind is left to decide, is this blasphemy or is this revelation? And here, again, the rhetorical pivot returns to the verb. After a sign and after an "I am" claim, John's narrative keeps returning to pisteuō, to place trust, to step forward, to receive. The beloved disciple, the eyewitness voice in the text, already identifies himself by the relation he stands in, loved. That motif colors everything. To be a disciple is to be someone who has been addressed and loved, and who therefore responds in trust. John is not content to have you admire. He wants you to act. This leads us to a crucial observation. John's absence of the noun pistis, the static category faith, is not laziness. It is pedagogy. To speak of faith as if it were a noun, you possess risks turning relationship into property. John refuses that. He uses the verb because he wants to keep faith active, dynamic, embodied. Belief in John often involves a physical or relational movement, a step to the pool, a confession to a friend, a reception of sight, a willingness to touch the wounded one, to accept hospitality, to linger at a tomb. Belief is lived and repeated. It is something you do, not something you list on a resume. What does this mean pastorally? It reframes how we think of discipleship and conversion. John's Gospel holds together an initial turning, the decision to believe, and an ongoing abiding, menos. The verb and the motif of remaining are partners. When Jesus says, "Remain in me," meno, he is not giving a passive theological option. He is naming the grammar of the relationship. To believe is to enter a rhythm of staying, relying, listening. The call is not to a one-time assent, but to a sustained posture. John also shapes how the Spirit is presented in this dynamic. In the farewell discourse, which we will come to, the Paraclete, parakletos, is promised not as an external power show, but as an internal witness. The Spirit's role is to bring Jesus near. If the signs aim the reader toward identity, the Paraclete makes that identity present in the community and the conscience. The Spirit's arrival is an upgrade from proximity to indwelling. The Word enfleshed becomes the Spirit embodied among believers. But crucially, even the Spirit's work in John is filtered through the verb. The Spirit calls, convicts, comforts, and empowers faith that is lived. It is worth pausing on how John's method shapes the experience of reading his gospel. He is not building an abstract doctrine of belief. He is curating a gallery. Each room of images, each portrait of encounter is intended to do something to you. You move from the domestic warmth of Cana to the cool, unsettling healing at Bethesda. You proceed to the radical reversal of Lazarus. Then you are pressed into the long, intimate teaching of chapters 13 to 17, where Jesus explains the life of the relationship he has invited. By the time you reach the cross and the resurrection, John has already trained you to respond with a verb. The climactic narrative move. These signs are written so that you may believe, John 20:30-31, is less a proof than a summons. The gospel is performative. It crafts belief by recounting events shaped to evoke trust. There is also a strategic sociology in John's presentation. The beloved disciple's voice is a model for the reader. He is not simply reporting, he is modeling what it looks like to narrate from within love. The beloved disciple sees, remembers, and tells in a way that invites others into the same experiential posture. He is not offering a theological abstraction. He is offering an invitation to be loved and to move into that love by action. Two further vocabulary notes before we go deeper. First, when John speaks of signs instead of powers, he subtly undercuts the expectation that God's work should align with human categories of success. A sign might confound expectations. It points, it tests, it clarifies identity without reducing God's presence to functionality. Second, the drama of I am is theological. When Jesus employs ego eimi in ways that echo the divine name in the Old Testament, John is asking the reader to consider divine identity in human flesh. The reaction of the crowds at certain moments, from curiosity to rage, testifies to the seismic effect of such claims. At the same time, John is careful not to make belief a mere intellectual assent. His repeated verbs of trust are tied to bodily acts, communal practices, and the abiding presence of the Spirit. Take, for instance, the scene where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. It is a practical demonstration that redefines leadership and invites imitation. The gesture makes the ethics of belief concrete. When Jesus says, "If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet," he connects trust to service. Belief in John has hands, and yet, As we follow the trajectory from sign to I am to invitation, a tension emerges that the evangelist does not resolve by softening. This is not merely a warm, pastoral invitation that avoids risk. The signs unsettle, the I am claims provoke, and the world responds with division. The gospel itself records misunderstanding, hostility, and ultimately the fatal decision to remove Jesus. John's narrative is honest about cost. Belief is not costless. To step into the relationship Jesus offers can mean being estranged from certain social or religious securities. But John doesn't mitigate this. He narrates it so the reader can choose with eyes open, which raises the central question suggested by the title, why, after insisting on belief as an active verb, does John avoid the noun faith? Why does he never allow the comfortable consolidation of a noun that might become an identity badge? Because for John, to turn belief into a noun would be to domesticate the encounter. The noun risks stopping the motion. The verb preserves the dynamic. Belief remains movement, a continuing engagement with the Word who became flesh and now extends himself by word and spirit. We can already see how this shapes pastoral life. If the gospel calls us to act, then liturgy, prayer, fellowship, and service are not merely religious add-ons, but the grammar of belief. The church becomes the place where the word continues to be encountered through signs faithful to John's design, acts of mercy, testimony, the table, the words that interpret. The Spirit is promised to sustain that practice, to keep the movement alive. So far, we have surveyed John's strategy: prologue as thesis, signs as pointers, I am as identity claims, and belief as verb. We have seen how the beloved disciples' witness shapes the narrative and how each scene is designed to elicit movement. What remains is the moment where John intensifies everything by placing an I am without a predicate, a stark declaration that makes the crowd move to stones. That moment exposes what the entire gospel has been driving toward: identity claims that demand a decision. When Jesus says simply, I am, he is not drifting into mysticism. He is standing on the firm ground of divine self-revelation, and the room responds with the rawest human impulse. The floor drops. The conversation that has felt abstract up to that point becomes dangerously concrete. To be with Jesus is to stand face to face with a claim that unsettles the world's categories. That is why John's repeated use of the verb matters so deeply. It keeps the reader in motion, always deciding, always receiving, never resting in a tidy theological possession. The narrative pushes you to act, to step forward, to receive sight, to touch, to confess, to remain. And so we have arrived at the hinge. Signs point, I am names, and belief, the repeated verb, is the invited response that keeps the relationship alive. What follows from here is the farewell discourse, where Jesus prepares his community for absence by promising presence. The Spirit who will be the Parakletos, the helper, the advocate, the one who speaks on Jesus' behalf and brings Jesus near in a new mode. The discourse reframes the grammar of presence. Absence does not equal abandonment, but the promise of a paraclete also sets the terms. The relationship requires trust enacted over time. The Spirit constitutes a community that remains. All of this is John's pastoral architecture, and yet because it is architecture and not a schematic, it contains built-in tensions that must be navigated. The signs provoke, the claims unsettle, belief demands. We stand, as readers, at a threshold. The narrative will press us further into the farewell discourse, into the garden, the cross, the tomb, and finally into the empty space that begs for response. At the same time, we cannot ignore how John's choices challenge common modern tendencies. We live in an age that values possession of identity categories, doctrinal labels, moral self-descriptions. John refuses the comfort of possessing faith as a stable identity marker. He wants movement. He wants bodies that respond. He wants communities that embody trust. That is a radical corrective to any theology that would privatize belief into an internal state divorced from action. So where do we stand now? We have examined how John's prologue sets the theological horizon, how the 7 signs escalate authority and demand interpretation, and how the I am claims crystallize identity claims that force a choice. We have observed how John prefers pisteuō, belief as a verb, and how that preference informs the whole Gospel's pastoral design. We are poised to enter the farewell material where the paraclete is promised and the ethic of remaining, meno, is fleshed out. We are also about to confront the moment when an I am, without explanation, drives the crowd toward stones. That instant, a single, stark declaration, is where theology becomes perilous and where belief becomes costly. In that charged silence, the reader's decision is not merely theoretical, it is existential. Will we treat Jesus as a glorious sign to admire from a safe distance, or will we step into the relation he offers, letting the verb shape our living? Before we turn to the farewell discourse and the way John sustains faith as action in community, we must linger for a moment on the beloved disciple himself. His voice is not neutral. He speaks as someone who has been seen and loved by Jesus. That voice shapes the narrative's pastoral thrust. He is both model and mediator, the one who remembers and the one who invites others to remember the same. John writes as an old man who wishes younger readers to inhabit the same movement he has known. The story is not academic for him, it is testimonial. And this is the final point for this section. John's Gospel is an invitation to be moved. Its favorite verb, believe, is the engine of movement. The signs begin the motion, the I am claims push it deeper, and the paraclete promises to sustain it. The rest of the book will show how this all plays out in community, trial, and resurrection. But at each step, the narrative keeps asking the same precise, uncomfortable question. Will you do the thing I demand of you? Not simply affirm, but step into trust. When Jesus, in the middle of a charged synagogue conversation, says simply, "Before Abraham was, I am," the crowd moves. They reach for stones. That physical reaction is the exact kind of moment John wants us to face. Identity claims produce response. The gospel is designed to make you move now, not later, not in the abstract, but in the present tense of trusting. We left the narrative at a charged, dangerous line. Before Abraham was, I am. The room tightened. Stones were ready. That is precisely the kind of moment John wants to manufacture. A theological claim that forces a human decision. Now turn with me into the space where Jesus anticipates absence and prepares a community to keep moving. The Farewell Discourse, chapters 13 through 17. Here, John shifts from public signs and dramatic identity claims to intensive domestic instruction. If the signs were gallery exhibits meant to elicit a step, the farewell is a studio where the apprentices learn how to live after the teacher is gone. Begin with feet on the floor. Jesus' act of washing his disciples' feet is the pivotal pedagogical image in this section. It is an example, Greek hupodigma, and a reversal of expected status. The teacher becomes the servant, the leader stoops. John wants us to see that belief. The verb flows into concrete posture. If you have believed, you do not simply hold doctrine, you perform humility. Jesus tells them, in effect, if I, your teacher, have stooped to cleanse your disgraceful feet, then the grammar of life among you must be mutual service. The action reframes authority. In John's logic, to trust Jesus reorders relationships so that power becomes service. This is not sentimental, it is formative. The movement of pisteuō produces hands that wash. Closely connected to the feet is the new commandment Jesus gives, love one another as he has loved them. This command is not a generic ethical slogan. It is tethered to the memory of what they have seen and received. Love, in John, is the primary disciple mark. It is both the fruit and the proof of believing acting. The verbs cluster: love, keep, remain, abide. The language John uses insists that the inner reality of belonging must be visible in acts that bind the community. Here again, the absence of pistis is more than style, it is discipline. Faith in practice looks like mutual servanthood and costly love. Now listen to how Jesus frames presence once he is gone. He promises the paraclete, the parakletos, variously translated helper, advocate, counselor. The role of this spirit figure is precise and paradoxical. The paraclete is an other than Jesus, who yet continues Jesus' own presence. When Jesus leaves the room, he does not abandon proximity, he changes its modality. Instead of physical side-by-side, the community receives an internal witness. The Spirit will testify about Jesus, bring to remembrance his words, convict the world regarding sin and judgment and righteousness, and guide the disciples into all truth. The Paraclete is not a gimmick to generate power displays. In Johannine theology, the Spirit's chief function is to keep the relation alive, to perpetuate the word's reality within hearts and households. Notice how this continues John's concern with grammar. The Paraclete acts upon the sphere of verbs. The Spirit moves people to speak, to remember, to confess, to bear witness, all actions. The Spirit's work is not to provide a static possession, but to keep the community in dynamic relation to the risen Jesus. The Paraclete's presence translates the initial movement of belief into sustained practice. The inner guide impels ongoing trust and obedience. That is why John pairs the promise of the Spirit with the recurring call to remain, meno. Abiding is not an optional spiritual state. It is the relational technique by which a believer keeps living out the verb of belief day after day. John's theology of remaining reaches its clearest form in the vine chapter. I am the true vine, Jesus says. Abide in me, and I in you. The metaphor is agricultural and intimate. The branches do not choose to be fruit-bearing. Apart from their connection to the vine, their life is derivative of being nourished and pruned. Abiding entails receiving nourishment, submitting to pruning, and then producing fruit. Note the practical contours. Pruning hurts, but it promotes fruitfulness. Remaining requires dependence and openness to the gardener's hands. The vocation of a disciple is therefore both receptive and active, staying close enough to be shaped, acting in love as evidence of the connection. This vine image also helps us understand the ecclesial shape John imagines. The church is not primarily a club of correct creed holders. It is an organism formed by abiding. The harvest, in John's rhetorical economy, validates the living connection. When love appears in mutual service and witness, the sign language of a believing community is present. Notice, too, that the vine relationship presumes cost. Branches that refuse pruning are unfruitful and subject to removal. John does not hide that the life of belief carries risk and responsibility. Believing remains a verb that can be practiced poorly or well. It can thrive or wither. We must also trace how the farewell discourse shapes testimony across time. In chapter 17, Jesus prays the great high priestly prayer. It is a hinge. He prays for himself, for his immediate disciples, and crucially, for those who will believe because of their word. Here John extends his authorial horizon. The beloved disciple, as witness, becomes a bridge. The prayer invests the future reader with the very same relation the eyewitness enjoys. You, the reader, are directly solicited. Those who will believe through their testimony are included in the prayer. John authorizes future believing acts as part of an ongoing liturgy of trust. The verb of belief does not stop in the first-century room. It transmits across generations. There are a few theological refinements in Jesus' prayer worth highlighting. He prays for unity among believers. Unity, for John, is not organizational homogeneity. It is relational coherence, founded in shared participation in Jesus' life. Unity strengthens the credibility of the witness. The world, Jesus says, will know the Father because of the mutual love he commands. Again, witness is performative. Believing and remaining create a visible community that fulfills the evangelistic function. John refuses the privatization of belief. The life of trust is public and communal. The farewell discourse also sharpened a pattern already present in the gospel. Revelation begets opposition. Even promises of the Spirit and commands to remain are not guaranteed to produce unanimity. John records dissent, betrayal, and desertion. Belief in this narrative remains costly. It can mean rejection by certain social circles. It can mean misunderstanding. The story does not sanitize the consequences. It narrates them so that a deliberate choice can be made. We should pause on the shape of testimony John crafts. The beloved disciple is not an idealized hermit. He is a memory keeper who narrates by selecting scenes that create movement. The koinonia, fellowship, the gospel aims to build is experiential. It grows out of encounters where one is seen, forgiven, fed, taught, and loved. The beloved disciple's testimony is effective not because it proves a cold proposition, but because it recounts life-altering meetings with the one who called them. John thus trains his readers to trust narratives that are themselves instruments of belief. To read John well is to be positioned to perform the verb. The text is not neutral data but an enacting medium. At this point, we must return to a question that haunts modern readers. Why would John omit the noun for faith? We have rehearsed a lot of answers already, but the farewell discourse provides the most compelling one. John wants to keep the church in motion once the earthly Jesus is absent. A noun can calcify, a verb continues. The paraclete is given so the disciples and later generations will not fossilize their relationship into doctrine alone. To have the Spirit is to have ongoing conversion, ongoing listening, and ongoing obedience. The Spirit keeps belief active. That is John's pedagogical genius. There are pastoral implications for us that cannot be overstated. If belief is a verb, then spiritual formation emphasizes habits and practices. Prayer is not merely affirmation, but a repeated turning toward the Word. Worship is not a checklist, but a moment of reenacted recognition that the Word has come near. Community life will be the primary arena where the verb is practiced: meals, service, mutual confession, and the telling of the signs frame discipleship. The Paraclete promises resources for this life, but the Spirit's work typically flows through human instruments, words, actions, and embodied love. At the same time, John is not naive about experiences of doubt. The Gospel itself stages doubt repeatedly. Thomas, the royal official's family, and others ask for signs. The narrative accommodates questions without reducing them to failure. Belief as action sometimes follows hesitation. A person who doubts can still act toward Jesus, step forward, touch, inquire, and through such acts the movement of belief often begins. John's structure therefore offers pastoral space for honest wrestle. The absence of the noun does not make doubt illegitimate. It reframes it as an opportunity to act toward the living Word. How then should a contemporary listener respond to John's design? 3 practical next steps become clear from the discourse itself. First, practice abiding. Cultivate a daily rhythm that keeps you near Jesus' Word. Scripture reading, reflection, and communal worship that reenacts the signs and words you have heard. Second, embody service. Let humility shape your leadership and let mutual care be the criterion of authenticity. Third, testify. Tell the stories of encounters with Jesus so others can believe through your word. These are not magic formulas. They are the verb forms John uses to create communal life. It's also essential to reiterate a caution the evangelist himself would endorse. John does not promise that belief guarantees worldly success or miraculous outcomes. His signs function as pointers to identity and as summonses to trust. They are not contractual guarantees. The raising of Lazarus leads to plotting and death. Faith in John's narrative can bring real cost. The gospel asks for risk, belief that might estrange the believer from structures of respectability. But it also promises deeper life, abiding in the vine, indwelling of the Spirit, the communal love that marks God's people. We reach, then, the textual climax John intended. The entire architecture moves toward that simple, repeated verb, believe. It is uttered across scenes, in private and public, in the mouths of witnesses, and in the framing of the narrator. The Gospel's rhetorical movement is identity, sign, interpretation, invite. That sequence is not merely explanatory. It is an enacted pedagogy designed to produce present-tense, habitual trust. The beloved disciples' closing statements bring the whole strategy into focus. These signs are written so that you may believe, and believing is the way into life with the risen one. Now the question in the title presses again. Why did John employ the verb so often and avoid the noun? Because he knew a danger. To treat trust as property is to domesticate the encounter. He wants a living, risky, communal faith that moves people toward service, confession, and endurance. The Paraclete is given to keep that movement alive. The I am statements anchor identity. The signs push the hand to reach. The beloved disciple remembers and invites. So what does this mean for you as you close this video? John is not asking for a mental assent that sits on your shelf. He is pointing to a relational act, a present movement of trust. If the gospel you have just heard has touched you, the next step is not only to think but to do. Step toward the Lord in some concrete way. That might be as simple as taking a breath and naming your need, asking for help in prayer, reaching out to another believer and sharing your story, or serving someone in tangible need. Practice the verb. Believe and then remain. Let your life show the shape of the Word made flesh. If this study has opened a door for you, leave one word in the comments that describes how this reading landed on you today. Moved, questioning, seen, whatever is true, and share this with someone who knows the stories, but not the person. And if you want more careful readings that keep Greek to a minimum and implications clear, consider supporting the channel or joining as a member for deeper sessions. May the one who said, I am, draw you near, the Spirit who speaks on his behalf guide you into truth, and the love Jesus commands shape your hands and your household, so that believing remains an act you live each day.